It is a great honor to be here tonight. I am moved to have been invited to share ideas and stories that connect me with your work and vision. I'm also moved to be in Amsterdam and to look out on this beautiful evening. I mean, we still have 2.5 hours of daylight ahead of us. And we'll be out of here by 8:30, I hope. And to remember that 29 years ago, I gave my first academic paper this month over in the university section to a group of Bonhoeffer scholastics about whom we have had a few remarks and exchanges at dinner tonight. If you had told me at the time, I was a doctoral student plowing through what would be a lumbering 500-page dissertation on Bonhoeffer's early philosophical theology, that in 29 summers I would be back in Amsterdam, and we have not been back to Amsterdam. My wife Karen is here with me tonight, though we've lived in Berlin and spent plenty of time in Europe, that I would be engaged in this Christian-Muslim exchange with the opportunity to talk about Bonhoeffer, not to offer you an architectonic on his reading of the Kantian transcendental tradition, but to carry us on a journey through his thought that connects with research and writing and living that I've done related to the civil rights movement, in hopes of arousing your imaginations and in some way offering food for thought, ideas, suggestions that may hopefully enrich our exchanges in the coming days. I did send you a title. It was, "Are We Still of Any Use?" I didn't send you a subtitle. I'm not good at subtitles, and a couple of days ago I texted my grad students back at the University of Virginia and asked them for recommendations. I shouldn't have done it, because the recommendations I got, once they realized that I was speaking in Amsterdam, were something like experiencing Bonhoeffer's high Christology, or surviving Eucharistic munchies, or something like this. Ridiculous, of course, because Amsterdam is such a diverse and marvelous city, and Karen and I have been living in a quiet neighborhood south of the Rijksmuseum for the past few days. But I suppose the subtitle would be Virtuous Character, Common Values, Shared Visions. So thanks again. In the last 2 years of his life, most of which were spent in a cell block of a Gestapo prison in Berlin, before descending into the final 2 months of the hell of torture centers and concentration camps, Dietrich Bonhoeffer grasped a heightened and expansive sense of the presence of God. He said it came to him as a great liberation. These letters and papers from prison, written in lightning flashes of insight and trial combinations, ponder a manner of being Christian more capacious than the pursuit of individual holiness, which Bonhoeffer, worried now in prison, he had overstated in his earlier Cost of Discipleship, a book that seemed to him not only too individualistic, but perhaps too heroic in its severe Christian call to come, follow, and die. We are approaching a completely religionless age, Bonhoeffer wrote in the most misunderstood passage in the published letters and papers from prison. The rickety scaffolding of late 19th century Protestant liberalism had collapsed finally in the German church's complicity with Hitler. And any attempt, Bonhoeffer said, to force that old ordeal once again into the shape of a powerful institution would only delay its inescapable reckoning and, in many respects, its inescapable demise. And he asked, how could one be a Christian, be a disciple, clothed not in the adornments of nationhood and race or religion, but having, as St. Paul tells the Galatians, put on Christ? What is Christianity? Or who is Christ for us today? Many letters in these final papers read as a litany for a chastened faith and are written in the form of basic questions about the reality of God and about the meaning of Christianity in the wake not only of its colossal misuses and abuses in the Third Reich, but throughout the history of the West. These letters offer a kind of reckoning with inescapable truths about the galvanic noise and grotesque xenophobic figurations that had become the public expression of the Christian religion in the Third Reich. The time of words is over. Another passage from those late writings. Pious or theological, they're over, as is the age of inwardness and of conscience. And that means, too, the age of religion. What then was left? Barthian neo-orthodoxy, if you will, had richly funded the confessing church's resistance to Nazi aggression. The confessing church was the one dissenting body within the Lutheran church that sought to create a non-Nazi space. But the Bekennende Kirche had not, let us confess, enabled the civil courage to speak a concrete word against the great masquerade of evil. The great resistance church had finally been unwilling to render a concrete judgment in defense of the Jewish people, or any denunciation of the Reich's intent to create what my colleague Alain Confino has called in a recent book, A World Without Jews. As early as the summer of 1933, only months after the passage of the Nuremberg Laws, Bonhoeffer could see that many of the, what he called the Barthian dissidents who gravitated toward the Barmen confession were merely put off by the crude pronouncements of Bishop Mueller's bunctious lackeys and the brown-shirted theologians of the Nazi Party card-carrying guild. A Christo-ecclesial concentration too easily proved an excuse for avoiding hard realities and costly action, and it encouraged silence. The naive, starry-eyed idealist of the confessing church, Bonhoeffer wrote late that summer, insist that they are the real National Socialist. Even Pastor Niemöller, who we would all know later after the war as a great person of conscience, and his cronies still entertain the delusional hope of preserving the sacred freedoms of the church while affirming the political authority of Hitler. And they do so under the pretense of preserving pure doctrine. By contrast, Bonhoeffer's new comrades in the conspiracy, most of whom were not coming out of theological and confessional settings, fastened themselves to concrete action with forthright resolve. This puzzling divergence, the spinelessness of the dissident church people on the one hand, and the civil courage of the humanist conspirators on the other, inspired Bonhoeffer to ponder what he called the beatification of those who are persecuted for the sake of a just cause. Portraying a world full of depravity and menace as he had done in Discipleship or the Cost of Discipleship might seem a more accurate reflection of the zeitgeist, but beginning in his ethics writings a few years before his imprisonment, Bonhoeffer would move well beyond such depictions and their implied divisions between God and humankind. Camaraderie, generosity, humility, justice, righteous action, resistance. These illuminated a universal aspiration that, in Bonhoeffer's mind, was still enabled by the intensification of the Christological particular. But as the Christological particular intensified, the universal aspiration to build bridges, to create partnerships, to see the light of God and the other, and to learn the light of God, the will of God, and truth of God from the other became more expansive and alive. What I mean, he said, is that God the Eternal wants to be loved with our whole heart, not to the detriment of earthly love or to diminish it, but as a sort of cantus firmus to which the other voices of life resound in counterpoint. The cantus firmus holds sure, and the extremes can run their way into the world in new and unfamiliar forms. Where the cantus firmus is clear and distinct, a counterpoint can develop as mightily as it wants. But look at us now. Bonhoeffer is writing amid the ruins of the German Christian church from a Gestapo prison. People of the church, and not only people of the church, but men and women of conscience. We have been drenched by many storms. We have learnt the arts of equivocation and pretense. Experience has made us suspicious of others and kept us from being truthful and open. Intolerable conflicts have worn us down and even made us cynical. And then the question, are we still of any use? It's a pounding question, bracketing that of who the we might be. It's haunting on many levels. This was written on New Year's Day, 1943, just a few months before his arrest, and was written to his families and his intimates in the conspiracy. And it's a question that's always astonished and pounded me. In the posthumously published Letters and Papers from Prison, the essay goes by a name suggesting casual self-reflection. It's titled After 10 Years, A Reckoning Made at New Year's Day, 1943. But in substance, the piece reads as both an anguished profession of a theologian in the conspiracy and a pastoral letter to his comrades in the conspiracy, smoldering in the crucible of historical crisis, which promises that the future will be uncertain and personal goals will likely remain unfulfilled. Who stands firm amid the cataclysms and the tumult? As Bonhoeffer had spoken during his leadership of an anti-Nazi seminary in the mid to late 30s in a town called Finkenwalde in the northeast part of Germany and Pomerania, not too far from the Baltic Sea. He had spoken of a new monasticism. He had used those words. They're actually words that Reinhold Niebuhr had used in a letter earlier, a letter I discovered only after publishing the biography. But it was a wonderful discovery. He would imagine in these late writings a new nobility. Are we still of any use? Marked by fierce love of the world, spirited for Bonhoeffer by the excellences of Jesus Christ, sobered by history, and linked to all men and women who join the struggle for a more just and human world. This nobility, these aristocrats of responsibility, he said in one passing remark, might be recognized as ambassadors of the global ecumenical church, but others would surely come from the ranks of the romantics and the humanists and from all the children of Abraham. And they will be marked by compassion, attunement, honesty, forthrightness. And they will demand a return from the radio to the book, from feverishly acquisitive activity to contemplative leisure and stillness, from frenzy to composure, from the sensational to the reflective, from snobbery to modesty. Our witness might be summed up like this: taking each day as if it were the last, and yet living it faithfully and responsibly as if there were to be a great future. To think and to act with an eye on the coming generation, and to be ready to move on without fear or worry. Bonhoeffer pondered the shape of Christian witness amid the ruins of the church, and he did so not in an academic monograph or in a treatise, but in a montage of images, in lightning flashes of insight, illuminating at the same time a style of theological writing marked by a remarkably joyful fragmentariness. In one letter, by the way, Eberhard, his best friend, I notice more and more how much I am thinking and perceiving things in line with the Old Testament. In recent months, I have been reading much more the Old than the New. In fact, I find it very difficult to read the New these days. And I have realized that it is only when one knows the unutterability of the name of God that one can sometimes speak the name of Jesus Christ. Only when one loves life and the earth so much that everything seems to be lost and at its end, may one believe in the resurrection of the dead and in a new world. The earth that nourishes me has a right to my work and my strength. It is not fitting that I should despise the earth on which I have my life. I owe it faithfulness and I owe it gratitude. The earth, of course, had been a notion disfigured in the Aryan cult of home, hearth, blood, and soil. So many horrors had transpired in the course of human history precisely because Christians had turned their eyes upward, or worse, abandoned the way of Jesus, the way of the cross for some imagined ladder of ascent or escape. Bonhoeffer determined now to ponder how a Christian dissident should think about her sojourn on earth. And he spoke, too, of the grace of the strong sins. In a book, obscure book called Tyranny and Utopia, a book Bonhoeffer had read with admiration by Gerhard Ritter. Bonhoeffer had read of the rulers of Ritter's notional utopian state, that they will not be isolated as a class, for they will be continuously replaced by people advancing from lower levels. They will be distinguished from the rabble in their possession of elite intellectual gifts and moral maturity. Bonhoeffer read this in prison and excited him, and he took this to mean something like this, that the fate of Christianity in a world come of age might very well depend on a new elite of people with moral sensibilities shaped by a view from below, forming an aristocracy of responsibility, a nobility of righteous doers and prayerful pilgrims. These new elites would enlist to the cause all who exhibit the highest values, safeguarding in their silent deeds the besmirched words of freedom, humanity, and toleration. And they would move in a silent sanctuary of edifying words. Neither birth nor success, nor importantly for Bonhoeffer, intellectual or academic pedigree, would be the foundation of this nobility, but humility, faith, and sacrifice. They would be marked by the virtues of moderation, trust, steadfastness, patience, discipline, humility, modesty, and contentment. And they will not underestimate, the Lutheran theologian said, the significance of human example, which, as he noted, has its origins in the humanity of Jesus. For the church's word gains weight and power, if it gains weight and power at all, not through concepts, but through example. He brought this up again. Please do not forget this, he said to his friend Eberhard Bethge. It is exceedingly difficult to believe in God anymore without a living example. Of this, he said, I will write in more detail later. In fact, he would not return to the topic directly, and thus we regret the absence of a theological essay on exemplification. But perhaps in a few minutes tonight, we can offer some perspective on what I find an exciting theme that we may want to carry with us in the exchanges ahead. So, in this manner, if you will indulge me, I would like to turn to a body of research and writing that contributes richly, I think, to our purposes over the next 3 days, and at the same time to a clearer understanding of Bonhoeffer's late thoughts, but that may appear initially, at least, as an abrupt shift in focus. But I hope it's not. And what I'd like to do is to speak for a moment of the American Civil Rights Movement. 1955 to 1964 would be the dates I'm looking at here. And to think of it, to speak of it as an exemplification of many of Bonhoeffer's late thoughts, an exemplification of religionless Christianity and of the singularly fascinating theme of a new nobility of righteousness, an aristocracy of mercy, hospitality, forgiveness, and civil courage. And as an especially luminous instance of differing influences and traditions coalescing against shared goals for the sake of the good. To be sure, there are numerous intriguing biographical threads that connect Bonhoeffer to the civil rights story, which we can talk about later, out on the terrace, maybe, or never, I don't know. We might, for example, follow the story of one Franklin Fisher, the African-American seminarian from Birmingham, Alabama, son of a Baptist pastor, the pastor of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, who invited this straight-arrow Berliner, who was 25 years old with 2 doctoral degrees under his belt, to join him for worship on a Sunday morning in the fall of 1930 at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. Bonhoeffer was in New York for a year. And we might follow Franklin Fisher as he gently leads this exceedingly confident young Berlin scholar into what Bonhoeffer would later call the Church of the Outcast of America, where he experienced a profound awakening to new spiritual energies and theological convictions, and as importantly, a new understanding of the theological vocation of how to do it. But this evening, I would us rather build a bridge from different material to consider the lived theologies of the movement for just a few minutes as an enactment, an embodiment, an exemplification of virtuous character, common values, shared visions. To see, as I think Bonhoeffer would have, the extraordinary Pentecostal, with a small p, events that spread like wildfire and made America a better nation. The Montgomery bus boycott, the campaigns in Birmingham and Memphis, the freedom rides and sit-ins, the voter registration drives, and the long hot summers, especially that of 1964, as attestations of non-religious Christianity, the church for others, of living, this is another late Bonhoeffer notion, in the world, before God, as if there were no God. Indeed, I am confident Bonhoeffer would have discerned in these years a vivid rendering of, and this comes from a gorgeous early sermon from Barcelona, the torches of divine fire, torches of divine clarity, divine light in the midst of a world that has sunk into night, torches pointing toward the light, torches on which others can light their own torches, torches ignited by the magnificence of the divine glory. It's what I call the fire sermon, and I'm happy to share it with you later. I'll preach it all right now, but alas, we move on. The civil rights movement, certainly until 1964, grew out of the energies and disciplines of Christian conviction. Quite aside from Martin Luther King and his sartorial, resplendent preacher comrades in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the founding mothers and fathers of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the younger, edgier, denim-clad farmers and bohemian poets and intellectuals, often considered by historians the secularizing wave of the movement, were more often than not people of exuberant faith with imagination shaped by diverse theological influences, mixed in often unusual, exotic combinations according to the demands of the situation, a veritable gumbo of influences and sources. Just within the Christian tradition, one can see a mixing of theological modernism, holiness fervor, contemplative asceticism, social gospel idealism, Protestant liberal hope, Anabaptist political peacemaking and organizing humility, evangelical piety, and not a little Pentecostal whoop-ass. All of this were part of the mix. At SNCC's founding conference in Raleigh, North Carolina, an unapologetically theological mission statement was drafted that looked, in fact, more like Bonhoeffer's 1934 statements on Christ and peace at a World Council of Churches, or an early kind of ecumenical movement meeting in Fanø, Denmark, than SDS's 1962 Port Huron statement, though it was the Students for Democratic Society, which sought specifically to apply the vision of SNCC to a broader organizing field. But in fact, the New Left secularists seemed of a mind, as they drafted their document, that what black people do and say in church cannot be taken seriously. And so it would need to be recast in terms amenable to the therapeutic project of self-cultivation, self-direction, self-understanding, and creative self-expansion. Port Huron's white radicals demythologized the church-based movement to mean a quality of mind not compulsively driven by a sense of powerlessness, living free of repressions, living a life full and spontaneous and attuned to present and past experiences, an intuitive awareness of possibilities, an active sense of curiosity, an ability and willingness to learn. Not bad, okay? But not what was going on in the mass meetings and in the churches and in the freedom houses. SNCC's 1960 declaration, drafted by the African-American seminarian and Methodist missionary named James Lawson, stated differently, peace dominates war. Faith reconciles doubt. And we are summoned to live lives committed to social order and to communities, permeated by love and by the spirituality of nonviolence as it grows from the Christian tradition. Redemptive community, bearing witness to a manner of living that supersedes gross systems of social immorality and nurtures an atmosphere in which reconciliation and justice become actual possibilities in towns and neighborhoods. The movement practiced, performed, exemplified a public discipleship shaped by qualities of moderation, authenticity, trust, patience, humility, contentment. A manner of living, what Wesley Hogan at Duke University, who runs the documentary studies program, calls radical manners, characterized by the commitment to piecemeal social reform, the disciplines of community building and organizing, and a certain spiritual and emotional and psychic languor. The Methodist churchwoman Victoria Gray Adams would call the movement an enfleshened church. We were seed people, Miss Adams said one day before she passed in our living room in Charlottesville to a group of students on a cold winter afternoon. No matter how bleak the terrain looked out, we were planted for a rich harvest. And it was the church houses themselves out of which we had to move. These were the center of our lives. We didn't have much of anything really except the church. And when we put our faith in the churches, they were burned to the ground, but the church was there for us as the representation of the spirit of love. We were seed people, and we were a spirit people. And I don't care whether you call yourself a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or an atheist. What happened to us, ordinary people, could not have happened without an understanding of ourselves as spirit people. Fannie Lou Hamer of Rouville, Mississippi, a former sharecropper who became the prophetic voice of poor African Americans in the Mississippi Delta before she died in the mid-70s because of the lack of any health insurance in Mississippi, gave voice to a distinctively Christian discourse, evangelical, I would submit, in the most robust sense of the term, a disciplined, vibrant love of Jesus of Nazareth, of the whole scandalous story of the life, death, and resurrection, and at the same time, her love was a huge love, open to anyone who cared for the weak and the poor. God's love, the movement, virtuous character, common values, shared values. It's all about the welcoming table of God, Miss Hamer would say. The kind of welcoming table you find in the back of a rural black church in the Deep South, where in special homecoming Sundays and dinners on the ground, everybody's invited to bring their favorite meals, their favorite dishes, fried chicken and collard greens and fried okra and blackberry cobbler. Everyone's invited. Even Ross Barnett and James O. Eastland, the demagogic, racist governor and senator of the state, they would have to learn some manners at the welcoming table, but they were invited too. The churches have got to remember, she said, how Christ dealt with the people, like in the 4th chapter of Luke and the 18th verse when Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those that are bruised." Jesus was a radical and a militant. And were he living in the Mississippi Delta in 1964 or perhaps 2017, I'm from Mississippi, I can say that, he would be branded a red. He would be branded a communist. He would be branded a subversive and a revolutionary. Because, as Miss Hamer said, you know who Christ is? Christ is the one who's out there when it's happening. Christ is the one who's out there where it's happening. Miss Hamer compared, if I may say one more word about her, the student volunteers who came from the northern, western progressive universities in the 60s to the South to the Good Samaritan, reading Jesus' famous parable as a description of some new possibility emerging amidst the scorched summer fields of the Southern theater. And she said, to me, you know, if I had to choose today between the church and these young people who were coming down, Jews and Muslims and humanists and atheists and idealists and the like, and I was brought up in the church, she said, and I'm not against the church, but I'd choose the young people. They did something that gave us the hope that we prayed for so many years. And we had wondered if there was anybody human enough to see us as real people instead of animals. But these young people, coming under all kinds of banners than Christ, were the most Christ-like people I've ever known. Our goal was to reconcile, organizer Diane Nash said, to create a community recovered or fulfilled rather than simply gain power over the opposition. To redeem means to rehabilitate, to heal, to reconcile, rather than gain power. Ella Baker, Bob Moses, Fannie Lou Hamer, Charles Sherrod, Joan Trumpauer, Jim Lawson, Aaron Henry, Stokely Carmichael, John Lewis, Rosa Parks, Joanne Robinson, Dorothy Height, June Jordan, James Lawson, Martin Luther King Jr., so many others, aristocrats of responsibility, all, a nobility of conscience and civil courage. It's worth noting here, if I may, that as early as SNCC's founding conference in 1960, a folk singer by the name of Guy Carawan began appearing in civil rights circles, trying out a new version of an old favorite that he had made popular, along with Woody Guthrie and so many others, during the years of the labor movement, "We Shall Overcome." The song made a strong impression, suffice it to say, the first time it was introduced into the civil rights struggle, and became the most widely traveled anthem of the 1960s. People joining hands and swaying gently in time, singing, repeating the tender words, "Deep in my heart, I believe we shall overcome someday." It's a song with a long and varied and often disputed history, but its origin is found in the son of a slave, Charles Albert Tindley, born in Berlin, Maryland, in 1851, whose confessional affirmation in the first lyrics of the song named the movement's inner sense, and at the same time, the capacity of the intensely particular to become the generously universal. We won't sing it, but I'll read one verse. "A thousand snares are set for me and mountains in my way. If Jesus will my leader be, I'll overcome someday. I'll overcome someday, I'll overcome someday. If Jesus will my leader be, I'll overcome someday." The Inflation Church, like the Black Freedom Church upon which it drew nourishment, did not need to force or fold the outsider into the ecclesial vestments of the sanctuary. No, the non-Christian participants in the movement, of which there were many, in the student ranks, among organizers, and among local people as well, quite often understood the peculiar manners and speech of the Inflation Church as an eloquent and unexpectedly powerful articulation of the moral sources that animated and sustained their work in the South, the entry point for their own humanistic aspirations. And in many instances, the living faith of local African Americans challenge the presuppositions of secular activists as well as those of more doctrinally fixed men and women. And this is illustrated beautifully in a letter written by a Harvard student to his roommate back in Cambridge. These come from a wonderful archive in Jackson, Mississippi. He writes, "I went to church today. Third time since I've been here. You know, it's just like the scene in James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, but it's real. There's a direct tie between every person in that church and God, and every person with me and I with them. Wow!" Exclamation mark. Another student wrote to her family in New York, "I left the meeting tonight at a small Negro church wondering the eternal question of God, which we so easily answer with terms of science and evolution and theories of the beginning. We think more or less in the context which we were brought up, liberal and thought-provoking though it is still enslaving to us. And now I'm finding a new way." I really love these testimonies of volunteers and staff members who had never encountered such vivid, costly, joyful conviction. And I'm always inclined to read them not only as exemplifications of the church for others, but as secular parables in the wonderful sense that Karl Barth described late in the Church Dogmatics of meditation on how certain worldly lights, he said, ostensibly not associated with Jesus Christ, nonetheless become signs of redemption and in their relative autonomy bespeak God's redemptive and universal goodness. In any case, many of these letters and papers from the Magnolia jungles recall Bonhoeffer's remarkable admission that he made at the end of 1931 that in all of his 9 months in the United States, he heard the voice of Jesus only in the Church of the Outcasts of America, by which he meant at the pulpit of Adam Clayton Powell Sr., at the Abyssinian Baptist Church, and possibly at 1 or 2 rural black churches in the Deep South on a drive through the Jim Crow South that he made with a Frenchman named Jean Lasserre. This is the last letter I'll read from the archives of students in 64 and 65. Sunday, Lord, I went to a real whoop and holler church with people shouting and screaming and stomping. The sermon began as a talk and ended up as a song. The preacher jumped up and down and had tears running down his eyes, and everybody had tears running down their face, and I had tears running down my face. And he finally was overcome by the sheer power of his word and started to sing This Little Light of Mine in the middle of the sentence. And then we joined him, and people came up to grab his hand. I was one of them. You know, this is the only house of God I have ever been in my life. But it was real and powerful and glorious. And then he says, Amen. Blacks and whites gathering together in tension-filled COFO offices and mass meetings in black churches and smoky debates and cafes and freedom houses. And wherever chaos broke out for the sake of the beloved community, everyone was saying it feels like church, but so much better. An incarnational ethic encouraged student volunteers and SNCC staff members not only to act and to organize, but simply to be present with each other and with the poor. Whenever you really want to do something with somebody else and for somebody else, said Bob Moses, who later became a Buddhist, then the first thing you have to do is to make the personal connection. You have to find out who it is you're really working with. You have to be with and be interested in that person. Being a revolutionary, someone once said during a staff meeting, and some of these staff meetings just are so filled with untapped theological power, this long staff meetings from SNCC from 61 until 67. Being a revolutionary meant learning how to act out of the deepest silence. The cause of the movement, said Reverend Ed King, a white Methodist minister who Medgar Evers recruited to be the chaplain at Tougaloo College, the cause of the movement was to live the kind of life we wanted for the world in the midst of the struggle to change the world, for civil rights or anything, in the present time. To live in the present time, that kind of reality which we hoped the movement would bring about later. And cleaving to such proleptic anticipation, SNCC made time for reverie and solitude and nourishing rituals of leisure. A certain subversive languor, I love this, remained as an essential component of doing justice and enabling trust. And I was delighted to find that more than a few student volunteers from the North left the South out of boredom because there wasn't enough to do. There was too much sitting around on porches, drinking tea, talking, sharing stories at the end of the afternoon, waiting, listening, being. The luminous Jane Stembridge, the great poet, Reinhold Niebuhr student, dropout of Union, daughter of a Baptist pastor who was fired from his church in Lynchburg because one Sunday in 1962 he brought a group of African seminarians into First Baptist Church of Lynchburg, and Jane never was the same after that. But she was in the South with Bob Moses doing the nuts and bolts of the work. She described waiting as a discipline, as a spiritual and aesthetic attunement to the lonely center of the spinning earth. And in her estimation, or I should say, In her astonishing poetry, she self-published 3 volumes of poems. The movement could have used a lot more play and beauty and reverie. Listen to this. When we loved, we didn't love right. The mornings weren't funny, and we lost too much sleep. I wish we could do it all again with clown hats on. John Lewis borrowed Martin Luther King Jr.'s theme of redemptive suffering to affirm the cruciform trust that opens us and those around us to a force beyond ourselves, the force of righteous truth that is at the basis of human conscience. So yes, and we're getting near the end. Yes, wow, the simple act of 4 African-American students sitting down at a segregated lunch counter in Greensboro in 1960, praying over their meals, contained the seeds of radicalism that would flower into what Thomas Merton once described as the greatest social witness of Christian nonviolence in American history. Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., by the way, whose evangelical liberalism, I humbly submit, offers us this week an exceedingly rich resource for reflection and collaboration, once called himself, he said, "I am a victim of eclecticism, and may we all plead guilty to the charge." And his eclecticism, though, speaks to us as it clusters around basic convictions that recall the spirit, if not the substance, of Bonhoeffer's late ponderings. The conviction of worldly goodness and the integrity of all created life, the interrelatedness of existence, the somebodiness of every person. Merton, thinking about the civil rights movement, wrote this: "Our Christian calling does not make us superior to other people. It does not entitle us to judge everyone and decide for everybody. We do not have the answers to every social problem, and all conflicts have not been decided beforehand in favor of our side. No, our job is to struggle along with everybody else and collaborate with them in the difficult, frustrating task of seeking a solution to common problems, which are entirely strange and new to us all." In the final year of his life, let us not forget, Dr. King turned his attention directly to the economic sources of racism in his organization of the Poor People's Campaign, which he hoped would dramatize the sobering fact that the right to vote and the right to health insurance and the right to eat in any establishment failed to affect the material social conditions of Americans, failed to guarantee health insurance, failed to guarantee a just wage. And among the demands of the Poor People's Campaign were full employment, a guaranteed annual income, construction funds for low-income housing, and King, you may recall, had planned to lead a procession of mule carts with thousands of people in tow from Mississippi to Washington, where the participants would construct a shanty town near federal buildings. King thought it would be especially effective to bring actual shotgun shacks from the blighted traces of the rural South on flatbed trucks for the DC site. The proposed date for the Poor People's Campaign was April 22nd, 1968. Dr. King was murdered in Memphis on April 4th. But King surely never abandoned the hope of the lion lying down with the lamb. But his hope endured a final eschatological intensification that unsettled his worldly confidences, took him quite literally to wit's end, and threw him back finally on his earliest convictions. Not to seek an ambitious campaign to redeem the soul of America. The soul of America may very well be poisoned. But to places where the inbreaking of a new kingdom might be glimpsed and tasted and felt. Never to be colonized, never to mistake our tent for a temple, to redemptive spaces, beloved communities, churches of the outcast, excluded neighborhoods, experiments in truth, God movements, quiet revolutions, Finkenwaldes freedom houses, free-floating monastic communities, demonstration plots for the kingdom, inflation churches, nonviolent armies, people of prayer and righteous action. The church, Bonhoeffer said, has no monopoly on human flourishing. Just look at us. Movements, agencies, and person outside often reckon with the human condition with greater attention to the detail and scope of the world's challenges. The day may come, he said, when Christians will once more be called to speak the word of God in such a way that the world is changed and renewed, but it will surely be in a new language, nourished by sources unfamiliar to many. And now I turn to the conclusion. Okay, give me four or 5 minutes, and then. But it's a wonderful conclusion. I say that because Bonhoeffer's story, after spending 10 years on his life, is more fascinating to me and speaks more richly to me than even when I began that long journey. Anyway, for a long time, honestly, since he first became aware of his religious heritage as a German Lutheran, Bonhoeffer felt a certain fatigue and a spiritual, emotional estrangement from Western Christianity. You can read this everywhere from his earliest papers on. In the West, Christianity is approaching its end, he wrote in 1934. What had begun as longings unfulfilled by Lutheranism, leading him to the basilicas of Rome and the convents of Britain, eventually brought him to a point where he seemed no longer inclined to assert the superiority of the Christian religion, at least not as it was lived now. 1 year into the Kirchenkampf, the church struggle against Hitler, he allowed that the Hindu Gandhi gave vivid expression to the strange and slow journey that leads through repentance to the new life in Jesus better than any Christian he had encountered. The story of Bonhoeffer's brief correspondence with the great peace prophet from India has often been told. Less familiar are Bonhoeffer's encounters with Islam. And this is the way I would like to close my reflections this evening. The encounters that took place during a trip to Italy when Bonhoeffer's brother Klaus, inspired by, as he said, imaginative thoughts and conversations, persuaded his younger brother to join him on an unscheduled excursion to North Africa. On April 29th, 1924, the two precocious Bonhoeffer brothers climbed aboard a freighter for Libya, failing to notify the parents, which they never heard the end of. There, Bonhoeffer encountered a life utterly foreign to him, a North German Lutheran, a whirlwind of strange impressions, sounds, and smells. But his responses to such novelties were those of an attentive, curious, and generous observer, not the misgivings of a pampered tourist. In 1924, you know, Libya remained under Italian occupation, enforced at times by brutal oppression. And Bonhoeffer's comments are striking for their sympathy toward the native Muslims. What enrages me most, he wrote in a letter to his sister, is that a people like the Arabs, who have such a well-developed sense of tradition and culture, are being transformed into slaves. When one sees that the Arabs are treated with great brutality and vulgarity by the Italian soldiers, one can understand their bitterness and callous fear. In Tripoli, the brothers were picked up at the harbor by a fellow German. They were surprised to hear the news of their arrival that had made the city's Italian newspaper. After checking into their hotel, an Arab building built in a grand European manner, the brothers, despite fatigue from the riotous boat ride the night before, made their way into the sun-baked streets of the port city. The first morning, they took a bus beyond the city limits to visit an oasis market where, in Bonhoeffer's book, his journals, you see him describing a colorful throng of figures and natives from the interior selling and trading ware. Impressed by the incredible calm and precision of the work and the unfamiliar but inviting rhythms of the place, Dietrich and Klaus appeared more intrigued, increasingly open, gamely absorbing the culture shock. Even now, he wrote a few weeks later, it seems like a dream to me. Arabs and Bedouins and Negroes sitting on donkeys in great picturesque white cloaks or with laden camels. The houses are low and chalk white. The living quarters open into the street. The artisans live in certain streets according to their professions. The streets are narrow and the inner city unpaved and very dusty, yet they are not dirty as they are in Italy. It is also a lot quieter. The pictures of the market and of our walks to the sea were fabulous. Outside the city, one sees Bedouin tents along with their inhabitants, to whose face and form the long white robes lend a brilliant appearance. If an open mind can be indicated by a willingness to cross borders and observe with respect, the brothers' notes from North Africa in 1924, despite the freight of some cultural bias, reveal something even more, a generous and open heart. Dietrich, no less than his brother Klaus, allowed his intuitive judgments to be continually tested by the stranger. And while their accounts may at times mirror their ambivalent experience of both being tourists and acting as amateur ethnographers, they lack the defensive element. And though written in a telegraphic style, lay open a world. Day before yesterday, we drove into the interior of the country for 2 days with our acquaintance. By chance, a troop of Italian soldiers drove with us. They even took us with them by car a good bit of the way. We found ourselves at the end of the earth. Another journey into the interior, 2 days by car, took the brothers to the desert outpost 100 kilometers south of Tripoli on the edge of the Nafusa Mountains. And Dietrich writes, as far as the scenery goes, the mountain range gives the impression of being peculiar but extraordinarily beautiful. Because a large group of Italians chanced to arrive on the same day as we did, I don't know why, great festival performances by the native black Arabs and Bedouins had been planned. Some of their performances involved fabulous tricks. The Bedouins' races with their amazing horses were very grand. At furious speeds, they readied their rifles, shot, and then, as if it were all a game, hurled their rifles into the air and caught them. As the sun was setting, we took a short walk. Several Arabs whom we met on our walk spoke to us. They were so incredibly friendly. They showed us a lot of things, and they said we were the first Germans who had been there, and this made them very happy. It gets cold after sunset, especially compared to the daytime temperatures, when the Ghibli, the south wind, so hated by the natives, is blowing, and sometimes reaches as high as 116. In spite of the terrible heat, I don't feel ill at all. The air is very dry, never humid, always windy, beautiful. Dietrich found the southern night sky truly magnificent. The heavens, he said, blazed in deep blues, against the sharp contours of the mountains, which were strewn with a few isolated olive trees. When the stars appeared in radiant light, the night sky flared against the vast and wonderful black. In the early mornings, he went to the window of a stone hut and watched as townswomen walked homeward in the translucent glow of sunrise. They had gone in darkness to milk the goats. Some men rode to the watering holes on donkeys as caravans arrived with wares for the city markets. Crowds soon gathered at the market and in the tea rooms, or stood around in the street, singing in monotone from the Quran to the accompaniment of tambourines. Everyone stopped and listened devoutly, Dietrich noted, giving generously to the collection of the alms that followed. Before returning to Tripoli, Dietrich and Klaus received an unexpected invitation to a princely reception in the tent of a Bedouin chief. Details remain vague on what transpired. They may have tripped over political issues or caused an unintended slight. Dietrich also came down with a violent stomach bug, which surely could have exasperated the situation. Whatever the case, the desert excursion ended abruptly, with the two brothers finding themselves whisked away in an Italian officer's car as unwelcome guests. His diary offers no insights and no complaint. What it does offer is this: Dietrich finally could not fathom this new religious world, and to his great credit, he would not pretend otherwise. Despite a habit entirely contemporary of trading in generalizations, he did not use his own missteps, whatever they may have been, as an excuse for blanket judgments, remaining instead a generous, if sometimes perplexed, observer of the unfamiliar. He would leave under no illusion that his brief foray into Muslim lands had equipped him to understand. He felt he was a completely empty container into which enormous quantities of the heaviest materials had been thrown. And on the voyage back to Italy, he described feeling as if fetters had been removed from his limbs. From a cafe in Syracuse, he wrote in his diary on May 10th, 1924, that should he ever return to North Africa and to the Muslim world, he would need to bring a more precise measure or be reduced once again to speechlessness. Real reinforcement through extensive study, that's the necessary thing, he allowed specifically, of the Islamic world, in order to avert the catastrophe, because what one has seen was enormous. He journeyed to the end of the world, he said, but his journey to the end of the earth had led finally to a certain interpretive defeat, which he accepted with humility and as an invitation to further education and exchange and conversation. So here we are tonight, accepting the invitation of this cosmopolitan Christian to join together in humility and wonder and exploring, discovering, and celebrating our common values, shared visions. Thank you.